Welcome to Renegade Inc., the show which allows us to think differently. For far too long, the electorate has been spoken down to. The message was simple. Politics is way too important to be put in the hands of the people. So, lip service to real democracy and sound bites that the media dutifully played became the tools that the political class deployed to manage the masses. But the centre ground and media monopoly wasn't ever going to hold. So how, in this information age, are the hundreds of thousands of people fired up by the ideas of social justice and real democratic values forging a new political era? People increasingly understand that Western economies have veered beyond the control of democratic governments. The phrase late capitalism captures some of this discontent, but doesn't go far enough to explain why so many of us feel so deeply disenfranchised. Joining me to discuss how we can revitalise democracy and re-energise generations of people who have been marginalised are the artist Novar FLIP and the philosopher Roman Krznaric. Gentlemen, thank you very much for swinging by. Good to have you. When we look out post-general election in the UK, Nova, start with you. We look out across the landscape of democracy. Young people, old people, and everything in between. Paint a picture of what you see when you look at the electorate and the state it's in.
I see a huge amount of more young people and more people in general just becoming engaged in the process who maybe weren't before. I'm actually one of those people myself. I'd never voted before this election and actually went from being a non-voter to someone who's decided to actually campaign and get completely involved.
Roman, what do you see when you look out at democracy? Do you see it as alive and well, or do you see that it needs a bit of attention?
I think there is a huge contradiction going on. A recent study from the Journal of Democracy showed that people in the United States who are born in the 1930s, around 70% of them feel it's essential to live in a democracy. But millennials, people born in the 80s and 90s, only about 30% of them feel it's essential to live in a democracy. Now, what does that tell us? That might tell us these are the people who might vote for Trump and the far right across Europe, but it also says that maybe young people are disenfranchised and unhappy with the kind of democracy that we have now, a very thin democracy dominated by political elites. And I think the real work is engaging people, making young people feel that democracy can change things, that we can revitalize the old representative democratic system, which might be dying because it can't respond very well to issues like climate change, immigration issues, terrorism, and austerity.
What took you from being a non-voter? What was the moment?
I think it was the last election before, when Ed Miliband was running. I didn't vote at that time, but I started to pay more attention and decided that this was important and that things needed to change in the political spectrum.
And why? Because you look at Miliband and you thought what?
It wasn't that he inspired me, it just that I felt that the country needed to change. I was engaged in political things that had nothing to do with Parliament or what was going on. When, as an artist, many years ago, I got involved with the Stop the War Coalition, and I did some music for them, and we performed at Trafalgar Square and marches and stuff. And I was engaged in that kind of thing because I just cared about the issue. But I didn't look at it as anything really to do with politics.
So can I just butt in there? The question which really comes to my mind hearing you speak is one about digital culture. We know that the average person checks their phone 110 times a day. People under the age of 24 are looking at some kind of iGadget, some kind of screen for about 10 hours a day. Now, is this what's switching people off politics, or is there a potential for it to turn them on?
I think that's probably actually very relevant to what has turned me onto politics. My recent just engagement in social media through my music activities has what's kind of led me to discussing a lot of social issues and building a type of debate platform myself. And that's a huge part of why I've got involved in politics.
What's your view then, that the digital revolution is revitalising democracy, potentially? Is that what you think?
I've changed my views. I mean, I used to think...
A brave man who changes his mind.
Yeah, well, as John Maynard Keynes said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? I used to think that digital culture was killing political engagement. We were shifting...
Why do you think?
I think we were shifting from an age of activism to slacktivism, where political engagement was becoming defined by sharing a video or signing an online petition. But what's really interesting is that as the depth of internet culture has gone up and more people are living their lives online, You would have thought, if that slacktivism approach was right, that political engagement on the streets would have gone down.
Right.
But no, the opposite has happened. We are living in an age of global political dissent that we haven't seen since the 1960s. The number of people engaging in social movements, whether engaging directly in politics and voting or protesting on the streets, has been going up around the world.
They use social media to announce gatherings and get people together. That's where I'll usually hear about these kind of things.
There's a confluence here that we're still trying to learn how to use digital culture to engage us in politics, but there's much more potential than I'd ever thought.
It's a hugely exciting moment, isn't it? Because let's just have a look at the vote by age stats. Within that graph, you can see an intergenerational conflict. And this is really the baby boomers at one end of the scale and the millennials, and both ridiculous terms, right? But we have to use them, sadly. And if I was a Labour strategist, I'd be very happy with this, because you're going to look at a Labour government in the next election which has more of the social issues that you worry about in their manifesto. What's your view on this?
I think there's a problem here for Labour, because on the surface it looks like this is amazing for Labour, right? Most young people are voting for the left. I think that the Labour Party is going to become complacent because of this. They're going to feel that just campaigning on the social issues, anti-austerity issues, is going to be enough to bring this generation along now and in the future. But this generation is also interested in two other key things which Labour currently isn't talking about. One is the environment, and the second thing is Brexit. Labour is fudging on Brexit, of course, as we all know, because they can't take a clear line because they're worried about alienating people who are for Brexit, and they don't want to really embrace the huge majority of young people who are against Britain leaving the European Union. And also all the focus on social issues has made them take their eye off the big issues such as climate change and ecological collapse.
I think you may be right about Brexit in that it's been avoided slightly, but I also think that's because there's been too much focus put on it. They've tried to use Brexit as like this huge issue to kind of divide and try and push people to choose one side or the other and kind of manipulate people's opinions. Like, I've done a few interviews and it always comes up and I'm kind of like, I don't want to focus on that either. I think we need to kind of, these kind of social issues and policies that they're trying to bring in are way more important.
Well, I think there's a much bigger issue here, which is about peace and stability in Europe. That if you're going to be alive in 30 years from now, like my children who are currently 8, the biggest question is, will there be peace in Europe? And the best way to guarantee peace, I think, is for Europe to stay as some kind of united political entity. And all the debates about Brexit going on in this country, on left and right and in the centre, have been about what are the pros and cons for Britain as a nation. But there's that wider question of what's going to happen in Europe, because that will affect absolutely everything. We know that there were wars in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, in the 1990s. We can't quite imagine now that there could ever be actually violent conflict between Western European nations, but this is what has been happening in Europe since 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia. We are in the greatest period of peace that we've seen for 400 years. We've lost that historical memory, and if we're not talking about Brexit and Europe, we are missing a massive trick about what makes for a kind of political context where you can actually fight for real things like healthcare and education and you know, decent public housing for people.
What then, on the Brexit point, just to conclude this, do you say if, for instance, your children in 20 years' time said, Dad, but you voted to stay and I guess you voted to remain, Dad, you actually handcuffed yourself to a burning platform because the EU was in an absolutely desperate state, the euro was doomed to fail, Juncker and friends were putting sort of economic conditions on Greece which were totally and utterly anti-human. Why did you vote for them?
I take the Yanis Varoufakis view, the former Greek finance minister, which is you try and create real democracy in Europe. You don't run away from it and let it fall apart. You actually try and revitalize it radically from within. That takes real social movement action. That takes carpe diem politics. That takes people on the street saying, no, we don't want these fat cats in Europe having their nice big civil servant salaries, but actually we need to create accountability, that every ministerial meeting should be live streamed so that you and your friends can see what's really happening in Europe and hold people to account.
Let's come back then to talk about some of the voting stats. And the more educated a person is, the more likely they are to vote Labour or Liberal Democrat.
There's a problem here, which is that education doesn't guarantee that you're going to be a progressive thinker or have empathy or anything. Germany was one of the most educated European countries in the 1920s. right? And in the 1930s, but there was an educated populace there who opted for National Socialism, who opted for fascism. Equally, we know that traditional college-educated Republican voters in the United States went straight for Trump, right? And they didn't change their allegiances fundamentally. I think what's happening here is what we need to think about is what kind of education and citizenship education do we give people? I think it needs to be about values. And it needs to be about values such as social justice. It needs to be about values such as human rights and ecological rights and so on. And if you don't filter values into education, you might have an educated populace, but there's still ones that can be easily manipulated and go down the old funnel of neoliberalism, which was what certainly I've been struggling against at least since the mid-1980s.
If we educated people about politics, they would be more engaged. Because I think a lot of people are not engaged with it, they just don't really, some of them don't really know what's going on. I had that moment where I kind of decided to engage and then I educated myself more. But I'm still learning about that. I'm still in the process of doing that. So I know that education helped me to engage.
Which is exactly the place to leave the first half, because we're going to come back and work those out in the second half. That's it for this bit. Join us after this short break for more from Novar FLIP and Roman Krznaric. Welcome back to Renegade Inc., the show which allows us to think differently. Before we talk more about reclaiming democracy with Novar FLIP and Roman Krznaric, let's have a quick look at this week's Renegade Inc. Index. As we always do, we start with our favourite tweets. First up is from Jess Benavara. I didn't vote Labour, and he's a bit too lefty for my liking, but I have a lot of respect for Jeremy Corbyn. He stuck to his principles. There's a novel idea, a politician sticking to his principles, and somebody from the other side giving him credit for doing so. What do you think of that?
I think it's evidence that people actually care about values, and they are sick of politics which is all about trying to get ahead of the other person, trying to win through media sound bites. People have ethics, they have morals, and this is what Jeremy Corbyn's appealing to. There's a kind of honesty there, someone who sticks to their principles.
Next up is from a guy called Novar FLIP. You might have heard of him. I have internal battles between anger and empathy towards some people. In the end, I lean towards empathy, and it pushes them towards anger. Great tweet.
Someone showed me some studies about empathy, that people are losing empathy. And it was all, I don't know if it's conspiracy theorist or from taking paracetamol and things that that's actually killing people's empathy. And I was reading about it, and that's kind of what inspired this.
Are pharmaceuticals killing empathy? You're the man to ask this.
There certainly is evidence of mass empathic decline over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly amongst young people. They're less and less able and willing to step into the shoes of others and understand things from their point of view. Now, whether it's happening due to pharmaceuticals or other things, I'm not sure. I think the main thing that's happening actually is our culture of mass consumption, and where people are really just buying it rather than just doing it. We're living in an age of hyper-individualism where the great question is, what's in it for me? And I think this is the real problem for empathy.
This one is from Scribbler. Whatever, the young are too lazy to vote. One election later. We regret to inform you that the young are too stupid to vote correctly. Now, John Major, I think, the former British Prime Minister, also said post-Brexit, we can't listen to the tyranny of the majority. Did you hear this? Wow, in a democracy. And finally, from Andy Keeson, lots of Tories blaming the unexpected youth vote. You hear that, young people? The Tory strategy relied on you not voting. Did it?
Absolutely, and that's why I think there's a great issue or a great question here, which is, should the voting age be lowered to 16? And how much will that actually change the political landscape?
One word answer, should it be lowered to 16?
Definitely.
Our book of the week this week is The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki. History tells us that when you want something done, you turn to a leader. The motto of the great seems to be bet on the expert, because crowds are often generally too stupid and dangerous. But Surowiecki explains in his book exactly why this conventional wisdom is wrong. The fact that if you want to make a correct decision or solve a problem, groups are remarkably intelligent, often smarter than the smartest person in the room. This idea has huge implications for how we run our businesses, political systems, and ultimately how we organise our society. And we have another little book here, which you might recognise.
I've seen that cover somewhere before.
Have you? Carpe Diem Regained, The Vanishing Art of Seizing the Day. You penned it. Pitch it to us.
Well, I think that the ancient ideal of carpe diem, seize the day, which goes back to the Roman poet Horace 2,000 years ago, it's been hijacked. It's been hijacked by consumer culture, where instead of just doing it, we're just buying it. It's being hijacked by 24/7 digital entertainment. Instead of just doing it, we're really just watching it and looking at our phones and screens. And I think it's also been hijacked by our culture of hyper-scheduled living. Just do it has become just plan it. We're so busy filling up our electronic calendars weeks in advance that we don't really have time for spontaneous action. And the real challenge here is, how do we claim back the seize the day spirit that goes back to the ancient Romans, not just for personal life, but for political life? How do we take carpe diem and seize the day on a collective scale to bring about change and revitalize democracy?
We recommend it. Great work, thank you. I just want to talk about Rise Up, the organisation that you're involved with. It's getting young people to vote again. It's getting, you want to reclaim democracy. How would you pitch Rise Up?
I think what we're trying to do with Rise Up is to reach a demographic of young people that are probably disenfranchised. I think a lot of these young people would prefer to see some form of rebellion than to join the political system.
So London riots over a...
Possibly, yeah. And I think what we're trying to do is to show them that maybe engaging in the political system could be that rebellion at this stage.
When it comes to people's news feeds, when it comes to people, how they get hold of their media, now I think it's impossible to just take your media from one source. Generationally, people on smart devices are getting very short clips of media right through to long reads. How are people consuming it, and what responsibility lies with the individual to filter that in the right way?
I think a lot of people now are consuming their media through people like sharing it on social media rather than maybe even going onto the news site themselves. Someone they've seen post a news article, and it comes down to maybe do they trust that person who's sharing it. And I think a lot of people have got to engage in our recent protests because maybe they trust my values or my opinion on the things that we're sharing. I definitely think it does come down to kind of trying to work it out yourself and having your own values and opinions of what's going on. And I think social media has become more powerful than mainstream media.
Do you worry about that?
When people have so many choices amongst the media that they get online, that they don't have frameworks of thinking in which to fit it all and ways to filter it. And that's why I think values-based education and more political citizenship education is so important, because otherwise we are just going to fall for infotainment rather than real political news or informed social commentary. We're not going to see the difference between them or not even really care about it. In a way, there's much more responsibility for the individual to make the right choices with the media that's being thrown at them from every single direction. So there's a real challenge there.
Let's come to carpe diem politics.
You know, when we think about the idea of carpe diem or seizing the day on the individual level, it's about me seizing opportunities in my life. And historically, that term has also been about spontaneous action and about living in the present moment. And it's also been partly about hedonism, about partying, about sex and drugs and rock and roll. Now, I believe there is a fifth form of seizing the day, which is what I call carpe diem politics. And what it's about taking these other four forms of seizing the day, opportunity, presence, spontaneity, and hedonism, and ratcheting them up to the collective level to bring about change. Look through history, some of the world's most powerful social movements have had carpe diem politics at their heart. Think of the protests that helped bring down the Berlin Wall in 1989. There were people seizing opportunity on a mass scale. It was spontaneous, people bought in this present moment. And they're also almost like in a state of hedonistic carnival, real partying, alongside very serious political intent.
And David Hasselhoff ended up on a wall in a leather jacket.
That's the ultimate in hedonistic revelry in a way. And I think that political movements find it very difficult to sustain themselves unless they have all these different elements in them. You actually need a bit of having a good time, having a bit of almost that medieval carnival spirit in order to keep people engaged. And this is why I worry a bit about shifting people into politics straight from digital media just into voting. I think...
You want a party in between?
I want a party in between.
You're up for that, though?
Definitely. I think that really fits into what we've been doing as well. I mean, with Rise Up, we're engaging young people with music artists. We've released music videos, and we have put on parties. We put on a nice event on the build up to the election. Some of their artists that young people want to see.
You've got to take your fun seriously.
You've got to take your partying very seriously.
Yeah.
Just before the Berlin Wall came down, there were mass rock concerts for tens of thousands of people in Berlin, in Leipzig, in other cities. Think back to June the 18th, 1999, one of the first great anti-capitalist protests in this country. We were all given carnival masks of different colours and had to follow our own colour as we weaved around the streets trying to avoid the police. But there was also music. There were the first great samba bands, which are all now part of classic political protests. But they really got us going. And I think people need to feel that they're having a good time.
So maybe we replace all these massive commercial music festivals with music/political festivals/artists/ and you I mean, that would be wonderful.
Well, I think this is exactly what you're doing, Nova. Look, you're a musician who's become a political activist, and these things will probably never be separated.
No, well, I actually was contacted this week. I can't really give any details, but off the back of this, someone contacted me and said, we need to put on a festival.
Theresa May at her place.
No, but yeah, just, you know, within the political spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
The problem is, have you ever seen Jeremy Corbyn dance?
But I kind of like it because there's something genuine about it. You know, if you see David Cameron dance or Tony Blair or any of that, they'll have watched some video somewhere and tried to replicate it. At least when Jeremy Corbyn tries to high-five somebody and smacks her in the, you know, then it's genuine, that he's honest. What is the role then of the artist today in political debate?
I think that the role of art is to change political culture. And it always has been. This is what the surrealists were doing, you know, in the 1920s and 1930s. The question is, what kind of art do we need today? What kind of music do we need to engage people? I think one of the tragedies of the referendum vote was that the whole arts community was so against Brexit, yet didn't take theatre onto the streets, which is what was happening in Eastern Europe in the 1980s. It was theatre groups which were at the lead of anti-government protest in Poland and Czechoslovakia and other countries, and we need a bit more of that today. You've also got to feel that your actions will make a difference.
Why? Because of the futility otherwise?
Yeah, because most apathy is based on the fact that people feel that whatever they do is just going to be a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
It's not going to change their lives or society's lives. So you have to be able to see the evidence around you. That's, of course, why electoral politics can be important, because it's a very focused way of seeing change happen. And when you know that 1 million young people voting in the last British election has made a difference, and it's very clear that it has, that makes you sit up and take notice and keep engaged, one would hope.
As we conclude, I just want to talk about this. Khan Ross wrote a book called Leaderless Revolution. And this idea of before, where you have a leader, whether they're strong and wrong, it doesn't matter, you know, but you just follow that leader. Now, with increasing amounts of information everywhere, people are, of course, more sceptical, but they're less willing to follow one strong leader. They actually want a flatter hierarchy, a more democratic process. No one person-led rise up. Is that right?
No, there's been a team of us, and I mean, we've encouraged just other people from the music communities and communities that would connect with young people to get involved. So it's definitely been like a large collective effort.
So these flatter hierarchies, do you worry about them, or do you think that's the way forward? Because I can tell you now, the Tory party in the UK would sit there and worry to death about them because they think, how do we control this?
I think there's two different directions society is going. One is the rise of authoritarian populist leaders. This is Trump, this is Le Pen, and other leaders like that in different countries, and they are taking us to extremist, anti-system politics, far-right politics. On the other hand, you've got the rise of horizontalism in multiple fields. You've got horizontal networks on social media, leaderless networks. You've got horizontalism growing in the economy. The rise, for example, of things like, just Wikipedia, Drupal, all sorts of online platforms which are basically leaderless. People are engaged. Car sharing, is another one. Community-led online networks. These things will filter through into politics and create more and more flat political movements, more leaderless movements. For example, Corbyn and the Labour Party, the focus on Corbyn is really quite an old-fashioned focus on a leader, because I think the future of politics in this country and other countries is the leaderless horizontal revolution.
But I think even Corbyn in his message he often speaks to the people that they have the power, it's on them.
That's right, because the thing is, people are looking to Corbyn, and it's a very difficult thing because I think that people do like leaders. They partly want to be led, but I don't think that is a strong form of future politics. And I hope that he recognises it, that actually his power comes from the grassroots.
Does he?
I think he does. I think from what I've seen him say that he does, and I think there's definitely a large groups of people who have felt that they want to support him because it's made them feel like they're doing something by themselves.
And he's reflecting a reality that they're experiencing back to them.
Definitely.
We asked at the beginning, or we've asked throughout the show, how do you reimagine democracy and how do you revitalise people? Start with you.
I think we need to look at what's just happened with this election and realise that all of these people who have come together have really made a difference, and we just have to continue in that direction and gather more people.
I think the future is in participatory democracy, ancient Greek style, where you're not just only involving men, because of course they excluded women and slaves and immigrants, but we are galvanizing people to engage in politics on the local level. I think the future of democracy is actually in cities, the big mega cities which are going to dominate the world over the next 50, 100 years, and we need to be democratizing politics at the urban level in a radical, deep way.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much. Congratulations on Rise Up and your work, and also congratulations on the book. That's it from Renegade Inc. HQ this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or tweet us @Renegade Inc. We'd love to hear from you. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.